The question is, with today's programming and the information about our incredible undergraduate and graduate programs and certificate programs, are you ready to make a difference in your community? Today's event really speaks to our institutional commitment to really understanding what the issues are at the moment and addressing those issues in a comprehensive and thoughtful way. Welcome to the program and welcome to the School of Labor and Urban Studies.
Thank you, Dean. And we'll move now to Andres Puerta, who is a professor in labor studies at the School of Labor and Urban Studies.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you, Gladys, for that and for all you do for the School of Labor and Urban Studies. I want to welcome everyone to the Fighting COVID Building Power discussion. All of us hope that you're joining us in good health and in a safe place. My name is Andres Puerta. I'm a trade unionist. I'm an organizer here in New York City, faculty member at SLU, and a very proud graduate of SLU a very long time ago. So like Dean said, SLU is the Center of Labor and Urban Studies here in New York City. And it's a leading institution, not only locally in New York City, but also nationally. Here's where academic and social leaders come to learn and to teach. I urge all of you that are not familiar with SLU to learn more about the School of Labor and Urban Studies and to really become part of the community and become part of the family. We organized this discussion primarily because we're facing a crisis, a healthcare crisis, as everyone knows, the COVID crisis, but the current crisis is magnifying the long-term crisis of working people fighting to build a voice, fighting to build a life in our economy, and fighting to build a democracy at work and outside of work. So our goal, I think people of goodwill, our goal is to solve both of these crises. And that's really what this discussion is focused on. So Diana Robinson will be our moderator. We are all I am personally very lucky that Diana is leading this discussion. I think we're all very lucky that Diana is going to guide this very, very important discussion. So again, I want to give a tremendous thanks to all the panelists and all the hard work that you do every day. We know that time is critical and that you're in the fight, but we're grateful that you're all here. And I want to give a tremendous thanks to all of the staff at SLU for quickly hustling to put this together. I'm really looking forward to this. I hope everyone is. So Diana, it's all yours.
Thank you, Andres. Good morning, everyone. I'm happy and honored to be able to be moderating this conversation. I'm Diana Robinson, the program coordinator of the Union Semester Program, also a proud graduate of the Masters in Labor Studies program at the School of Labor and Urban Studies. So as Andres mentioned, this panel is going to focus on the impact of COVID-19 on frontline workers and their response, what they're doing to organize and to ensure that workers have protections, but also looking at the future and thinking about how we continue to have these conversations about workers who are often not seen, but this crisis has put them in the forefront and what that has meant for them, for their families and for their health, and what worker organizations, community organizations, and unions are doing to fight back along with their members. So we're gonna have a quick historic analysis by Professor Joshua Freeman. He's a distinguished professor of history at Queens College and the School of Labor and Urban Studies. CUNY Historical Analysis in the Workers and Unions in Times of Crisis is kind of the historical perspective that he'll be given. But before we start that, we'd like to hold a moment of silence, which Professor Freeman would lead.
I think everyone knows, there's been an enormous toll on workers in New York City and across the country from COVID, including members of the unions who we have speakers from today. So we thought we'd just start by just having a moment of silence to acknowledge the enormous sacrifices that have taken place. Thank you all, and thank everyone for being here. It's often said that we are in an unprecedented situation. Never before have we had a combination of a severe public health crisis and severe economic crisis. And this is true. But workers in New York and in the country have gone through many crises before. And those experiences suggest ways that society changes as a result of calamities and how workers can build power during such exceptional moments. Since the late 1700s, New York City has gone through epidemics of yellow fever, cholera, polio, influenza. During the 1918-1919 influenza epidemic, 30,000 New Yorkers died, and the population was only 5.6 million then. So that's actually a death rate twice what we've experienced so far from COVID-19. We've had a series of severe economic depressions in this country, some as devastating as what we're going through right now. We fought many wars, and it's workers who often make the greatest sacrifices. During World War II, over 5,000 members of TWU Local 100 served in the armed forces. 76 of them died, and there have been natural disasters and terrorist attacks too. As terrible as these crises were, they did not cause worker activity or class conflict. To the contrary, some of the greatest worker mobilizations in US history took place during them. In time of crisis, workers' voices have become more prominent. Unions grew, and economic and social inequalities were reduced. The 1918-1919 flu pandemic has gotten attention lately, but it's almost never noted that the greatest strike wave in American history overlapped with it. During 1919, 4 million workers went on strike. That's 1 out of every 5 non-agricultural workers in the country. And this amazing strike wave began at the very height of the epidemic, and it continued through 1920 when there was a rebound of the flu. In January 1919, during the third of what was 4 waves of influenza to hit New York, 35,000 dressmakers, 90% women, walked off their jobs to demand a shorter work week and higher wages to deal with the increased cost of living. In Seattle, the flu killed 1,400 people. The city epidemic was in its final phase when on February 6, 1919, 65,000 workers began a general strike in support of striking shipyard workers, which totally shut down the city. The epidemic was not the cause of these strikes, but it did not stop workers from hitting the streets. 2 decades later, during the mass unemployment of the Great Depression and then during the many challenges of World War II, organized labor made its greatest gains ever. Union membership soared from 3 million to 15 million. The organizational breakthrough and the New Deal laws that labor helped win led to 30 years of post-war improvements in living standards and security for working people. Racial discrimination, by no means eliminated, significantly diminished during and after the war. So why were workers able to make such progress during these periods? Part of the reason is that social crises make obvious the central role workers play in society, their indispensability. During the 2 world wars, industrial workers were hailed as soldiers on the home front, as vital as victory to soldiers and sailors in combat. After 9/11 came a new recognition of first responders and the other workers who kept the finance industry and the city going. Most of the people killed in 9/11 were not high-level executives. They were police and fire and emergency medical workers, accountants, clerks, secretaries, restaurant workers, janitors, security guards, construction workers, flight attendants. The AFL-CIO lost 633 members on that day. A New York Times reporter wrote, "A city of unsoiled and unroughened hands has learned to love a class of laborers it once tried hard not to notice." Today, we're seeing the same thing with the recognition of what have come to be called essential workers, the healthcare workers, transit workers, truck drivers, delivery workers, grocery workers, warehouse workers, meatpacking workers, home aides, and others on whom our lives depend. These workers were just as essential the day before the epidemic began, but now they're being acknowledged, clapped for, hailed in roadside signs, and given the due they always deserved. This kind of recognition can have profound effects. A shared appreciation of the importance of essential workers, of the challenges they face, and the sacrifices they have made gives them new moral standing. It can empower these workers, change the way they see themselves and how others react to them. Such recognition was one reason why workers poured into unions during the two world wars, insisting that their needs be met and also that they have a say in shaping what post-war society would be like. During World War II, African Americans launched the Double V campaign for victory against racism at home, as well as enemies abroad. The other side of the enhanced status of working people during crises has been the delegitimation of authorities and elites that were self-serving, greedy, or incompetent. By the end of World War I, there was widespread disdain for war profiteers, for bankers and industrialists who made fortunes out of the misery of war. During the Great Depression, the political and business leaders who had ridden high during the 1920s fell into disgrace when their policies contributed to economic disaster and widespread suffering. The discrediting of established leaders opened the way for new forces to take the lead, left-wing groups, unions, and reform politicians like Franklin Roosevelt. Today, we have spectacular examples of incompetence, indifference, and corruption at the highest level of the federal government. Our state and local leaders get something of a pass because by comparison, they look so much better. But their failings have been deadly too. To just take one example, how was it that not a single representative of the governor or the mayor on the MTA board protested when the agency not only failed to provide its workers with protective equipment, but actually banned bus and subway workers from wearing masks well after the pandemic was savaging the city? And what about the COVID profiteers? People like Jeff Bezos making not millions, but billions off of the misery and death we are enduring. Or the big pharmaceutical companies poised to make a killing off of COVID drugs and vaccines. What greedy sleazes they are. Not even making a gesture like giving up profits for the duration of the disease. We need to pound home the moral, logistical, and political failures of the elites. We, working people, medical professionals, ordinary folks of all kinds, we can do better, and we have to demand that we be given the chance. It was not just the elevated social and moral standing of workers during past crises that allowed them to make great gains. It was also the dependence of society on their labor and the threat of its withdrawal. Both world wars resulted in big labor shortages, which forced employers to turn to workers they had previously discriminated against, African Americans, women, and others. Like it or not, they had to make concessions on pay, conditions, union recognition. Today, the situation is somewhat different. Overall unemployment is very high, but when it comes to many key jobs, warehouse workers, transit workers, truck drivers, delivery workers, among others, there are labor shortages as a result of increased demand and the absence of sick workers. And this gives workers enhanced power. Even small, short demonstrations and walkouts have led huge anti-union companies to make significant concessions. Often, crisis time gains of labor proved short-lived. During both world wars, women got jobs they'd been previously shut out of in factories, driving trolleys and buses and elsewhere, but when the wars ended, they were forced out of these positions. The big union membership gains of World War I were almost all reversed by the mid-1920s. After 9/11, while respect continued to be paid to fallen first responders, the other worker sacrifices were soon forgotten, and Wall Street moguls and real estate operators were put in charge of rebuilding Lower Manhattan with virtually no labor input. The Great Depression and World War II were exceptions because workers built institutional power in big new unions like the auto workers and the steel workers and within the Democratic Party, an important lesson for us today. Like previous crises, the COVID pandemic has unmasked the failures of the old order. Washington and many state and local governments have failed spectacularly at their most basic responsibility to protect the health and safety of the people. Many businesses have displayed a shocking indifference to the well-being of their employees, even to their very lives. The cults of privatization, government downsizing, and lean production and distribution have proved disastrous. If this is the best society can do, the time has come to try something different. Now's the time for working people to step forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Freeman, for that great historical context and really putting us in the frame of mind to think about how workers are building power. You know, our panel discussion is named Fighting COVID, Building Power, Workers and Unions on the Front Lines. So we're gonna be hearing from unions and community organizations who are allying and also supporting workers in their fight for safe workplaces. And also kind of how do we ensure that we continue to, again, visualize these workers and ensure that they're still considered essential, still valued. Because as Professor Freeman mentioned, a lot of times these workers are invisible and there isn't that much consideration to them. Also, when we think about who is doing this work, right? Given our country's history, we understand that a lot of times work is devalued based on who's doing it. And I think we have an opportunity to uplift these workers and ensure that all work is held with dignity and respected. So it's my great honor to introduce our panel for this discussion. We have 4 panelists today. We're going to be hearing from Angelis Solis. She is the Director of Worker Organizing with Make the Road Action and Make the Road New York. We're also going to be hearing from Nikki Keitman, who is the Communications and Political Director of Local 338 of the Retail Wholesale Department Store Union and the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. And we're also going to be hearing from Mark Henry from the Amalgamated Transit Union Local 1506. He's the President and Business Agent there. And lastly, we'll be hearing from the Transit Workers Union from Eric Logel, Vice President of the Train Operators, Conductors, and Tower Operators. So first, I'd like to start with Angelis. Angelis, we know that a lot of retail has shut down. But Amazon has continued to operate. How has the workplace changed for Amazon workers during this crisis? What are workers' concerns, and how has Amazon responded to workers' concerns? And if you want to say a little bit about Make the Road New York and kind of the work that you all do there.
Sure. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Angelis Solis. I'm the lead organizer at Make the Road New York, the director of work organizing at Make the Road Action. I grew up in Eastern Washington. I'm the daughter of a whistleblower. I grew up in a union household. I was trained with United Students Against Sweatshops, which works closely with the CUNY Labor Studies program. I worked at SEIU, and now I'm building community and worker power with Make the Road and with Athena nationally. Make the Road, we represent 24,000 members across New York City, primarily Black, Brown, immigrant, undocumented folks working in a variety of industries. When Diana talks about visibilizing those who are often invisible and undervalued in this city, I'm thinking about the fact that 1 in 6 undocumented workers in New York State has lost their job, meaning that those 5 others are working essential jobs and probably without the protections that they need. And then 1 in 4 adult Latinos in New York City have lost their job, right? So I'm thinking about our members who are excluded from so many state and federal benefits, but are also treated as the least important among us, although they are absolutely essential on the front lines. So Make the Road, we build power on housing, policing, accountability, tenant rights, and worker rights. And I want to start by grounding us in this conversation that Jeff Bezos is about to become a trillionaire when hundreds, possibly more, workers in the supply chain and warehousing and delivery have contracted COVID-19 as a direct result of going into a facility where Amazon did not invest enough protections for its workers, right? So this man, the global elite, is benefiting, profiting millions at the cost of human lives. Workers we speak with and our members share the stark reality of choosing not to go in. They talk about losing their income in a pandemic. They are more scared to lose their life than to lose their jobs, which is something that as a labor organizer is really stark to hear. Last night, we heard from a worker leader who shared many warehouse employees are sleeping in their cars in order not to bring the virus home. It's a grave injustice to the working class. It's a massive policy failure that the elite like Jeff Bezos continue to make this money at the cost of their workers. And in order to answer that question, Diana, I want to ground us in what it was like pre-pandemic and how that has translated to where we are now. So where we primarily organize in New York City and Staten Island, the JFK 8 warehouse has over 5,000 employees coming in from Jersey, Bronx, Manhattan, all over the city. They take ferries, buses, trains, they're driving, and these workers are commuting, bringing back whatever they may get in the warehouse back home to their communities. And because we've had the generous support of RWDSU, Make the Road, and New York Communities for Change, we've been organizing there since 2018, since the beginning of the opening of the warehouse when they started employing 1,000, 2,000, and now at 5,000 at full operating capacity. And in that time, there's been this major laundry list of worker violations that I could talk all day about. But the driving force behind so much of the pain that workers experience at Amazon is rate. Rate is the gold star of exploitation that sets Amazon apart from so many abusive employers. They are setting the precedent for other industries to model because of rate. Now, rate is essentially the quota that a worker has when they come into work, right? So at any other workplace, let's say like a 9-to-5 type of job, you have 2 15-minute breaks and half an hour lunch break. And that's your time, and that's the time your employer gives you to rest. And they're not necessarily counting every minute that you're not working at your desk. At Amazon, they are. Prior to the pandemic, workers could not bring cell phones in with them to the warehouse. They had to leave them in their lockers. So this means that your rate, which could be 2,000 in one day, you could be in pick and stow on the docks. Let's say it's 2,000 one day and you hit that goal, 2,000 items. The next day it could be 2,200. And there's no consultation with the workers. There's no sort of process or transparency or accountability as to why it is. It just is. And you have to hit it. And guess what? Every hour, minute, second is being surveilled and is tied to time off task. And time off task is what accumulates every time a worker may sit at their station just to rest, could stretch, go to the bathroom, maybe go to their locker to get their phone, call a family member if concerned. Everything is counted, and that's apart from your breaks. And that is used to pit workers against each other, to undermine worker organizing, and to penalize workers for resting, for drinking more water when they're thirsty. And all of that is tied to rate, right? Now, this is why we hear stories of workers peeing in bottles, developing chronic and acute health conditions. I'm thinking of one of our members, Rena, who, prior to working at Amazon, she had never had these stomach issues and now has dealt with some severe stomach issues for over 2 years since working at Amazon, because she has learned to eat her food so fast and run back to her station that her body has these intense reactions. And that's directly because of the time off task and the pressures to meet rate, right? Make the Road, along with NYCC, Teamsters, a number of our union brothers and sisters across the country, we collected data from 25 warehouses that studies the links to rate and chronic injuries. And what we found was exactly what we expected, that rate is driving workers to have increased injuries and furthering their sense of isolation, anxiety, and depression. NICOSH also named Amazon as one of the most dangerous workplaces in America in 2019 because of the uptick in worker suicides, anxiety, depression, and major issues that are resulting from just the brutal conditions in the warehouse. So that's prior to the pandemic. I'm sorry, I wanted to get all that out there because it's important to set the tone for what it was already like.
No, and I think it's really important also to give that context so people understand what's been happening. Yeah.
Thank you. And you know, to wrap on this point, consider the anxieties of going into work in a pandemic now, right? We have members who say, I'm proud of going into work and packing diapers and gloves and necessities, but I don't feel the same way when I'm risking my life to pack glitter tattoos and board games, right? When I know I'm entering into a contaminated facility. Our members, they used to get the beginning of March, okay, we have one confirmed case of COVID at the facility. Make sure you bring a scarf or something you can cover your face with. That is what the world's richest corporation could provide as a measure of safety. And now it is past saying the number of cases. We expect there to be over 60 confirmed cases at JFK 8, and they refuse to give us the numbers. Despite us knowing, counting, tracing, workers themselves saying, we know it's past 30, 40, 50, 60. They get daily texts every day and are still expected to go to work. At the end of this month, their unlimited paid time off, meaning if they chose not to go to work out of the safety of their families, ends, meaning they either lose their jobs and their health insurance, or they have to go into work, right? So that is the condition, or that is a situation facing workers now. And lastly, the strikes at Amazon, they shed a spotlight on the need for PPE and social distancing measures, but workers did not get masks until mid-April. And even now, oversight and accountability and transparency is limited. And instead of investing in bargaining, instead of investing in their workers and listening to their workers, Amazon, along with a ton of other corporations, are investing in heat tracking technology to surveil worker organizing. I want to say that again. Instead of listening to workers, corporations are so scared of collective organizing. They are investing their millions into heat tracking worker organizing so they can undermine it and dismantle it. And this is something that we're going to see in Amazon and Whole Foods and a bunch of other workplaces if we aren't prepared and act accordingly. Yeah.
So Angelise, you mentioned, there had been organizing happening on Amazon for several years. And recently there have been these strikes and also walkouts. And prior to this year, there had been walkouts in Minnesota and things like that. How have these walkouts and retaliatory firings impacted the organizing? Has it changed it? Has this crisis changed the kind of organizing that's happening?
Yes. In any worker organizing campaign, when a corporation or a boss fires a worker, it's to send a message, and it's to send a message to the other workers most of the time. We knew that when Chris Smalls was retaliated against in Staten Island, we knew that would add fuel to the fire of so many warehouses across the country, management also finding ways to silence other whistleblowers. So it was absolutely important to throw all of our support behind Chris Smalls, Bashir Muhammad, Maria Costa, Emily Cunningham, and those are just a few of the whistleblowers that we know of in the Amazon supply chain. I will also add that Amazon showed their cards right after the firing of Chris Smalls. The leaked memos from a meeting with Jeff Bezos himself demonstrated their union busting strategies. And not just that, they demonstrated just how they see their primarily Black and brown workforce in Amazon. They absolutely painted whistleblowers in a racist, classist way that shows us just how they demonstrate a pattern of disrespect towards employees who speak up. Mm-hmm. But workers across the country, with the support of many local organizations in Athena and worker organizations that have been building power in contexts for several years, we've been carrying out a 3-tiered strategy. So that has been moving elected officials and decision makers, of course, moving workers and building worker power inside of the shop itself, and building community support, right? So I'll speak to just some of the work that has been done in the last few months at Amazon. On a congressional level, Senator Sanders, Sherrod Brown, Representative Ilhan Omar, AOC, and a number of others have called for national OSHA investigations because of our pushing on a coordinated scale, saying, listen to these workers. There is no accountability. There is no oversight. Workers would sneak in phones to take pictures and videos of crowded break rooms, of lack of proper protective equipment, recorded conversations with management that we could use to pressure decision makers to act, right? And because of that, we've been able to call for national OSHA investigations, send letters to Bezos, and we're also calling the House Judiciary Committee to break up Amazon and enact antitrust legislation, which is a key strategy to unionizing Amazon one day, as well as forcing them to pay the taxes that are overdue. Continuing with the elected strategy and decision makers, a coalition of 13 attorney generals have sent letters to Bezos demanding answers on why a corporation that has amassed billions in a pandemic has so many grievances of unpaid sick leave. The worker organizations of Athena are developing a national committee of worker leaders to regularly meet and respond to this pandemic. And just on a local level, our worker organizing, we meet regularly over Zoom. We have found contacts through Facebook. We have found contacts online because of, in an effort to protect our organizers from doing their daily warehouse trips, right? But regardless, we're still finding a way to build power, doing what we can, finding contacts, having those one-on-ones, bringing workers together for meetings over Zoom, connecting them to press, connecting them to other worker organizing efforts, education, agitation. And for the larger community, we've seen Amazon Prime members organize worker solidarity groups. Tech workers are speaking up for warehouse worker rights and their own rights. And the general public is just waking up to the tragedy that the global elite are doing just fine while their working class employees can go get sick and die for their profits. And I think that Amazon, especially Jeff Bezos, especially this, the lack of inaction on Jeff Bezos and Amazon on a federal level has pulled back the covers on all of the ways Amazon has a stranglehold in our communities, and all of the ways that they're damaging local businesses, spreading disease in our communities because they're refusing to enact real protections. And overall, additionally, here in New York City, starving our public hospitals and schools of the resources they need to provide for students and provide for patients in a pandemic. Right? Our public institutions are starved because massive corporations like Amazon are hoarding the wealth and hurting their workers.
Yeah, thank you, Angelis. So Angelis, we did get a question. If you could describe what the heat tracking is. There's a couple different technologies being considered and being solicited. So Amazon has already been under fire for their facial recognition technology. Recognition spelled with a K. This technology is facial recognition, and this is what happens when you have a massive tech corporation that also operates logistics, employs millions of warehouse workers, and works in delivery. They will employ every tool at their disposal to undermine worker organizing. Now, before talking about the heat tracking that's popping up now, I want to give light to the No Tech for ICE campaign that Make the Road has also been a major driver in, along with our colleagues at Athena, as well as the No Tech for Police campaigns. Amazon has been notorious for soliciting this flawed facial recognition technology to law enforcement, to Palantir, ICE, and Customs and Border Patrol. So basically, these agencies have this recognition technology, and not to mention all of the tech services and infrastructure that Amazon Web Services provide to track, arrest, detain, and deport immigrants and hurt people of color. And it's really important that, like, when we're talking about organizing Amazon, we recognize the ways that Amazon is directly collaborating with and supporting the agencies that harm communities of color that include the workers in their workforce, right? We have to look at it through an intersectional organizing frame as well. Now that technology has received its own lots of campaigning against recognition and the collaboration with ICE. Now the heat tracking technology is something that we've seen pop up
honestly in Israel. In Israel, a lot of the surveillance technology has been tested and tried out and used in different cities across the US, just tested. But I don't have a lot of the specifics, and you can go in a bunch of different directions, but you can look into Whole Foods, heat track, and Amazon heat mapping technology to see how it works. And I'll also add in one more thing. When we've done disruptions, which we love to do at Make the Road, we've been able to infiltrate various Amazon Web Services conferences with our union brothers and sisters in Toronto, Canada, and here in the States. The badges that they give you at the conference have essentially a sort of chip that tracks your movements at an Amazon conference, collects data on the certain booths that you visit so that they can later follow up with you and provide you tailored content as to what you're most likely to buy. And that is if you are actively, willingly participating in an Amazon conference. Now imagine if you're a warehouse worker that's organizing and Amazon has a target on your back. They're gonna use all those tools against you.
Thank you, Angelis, for that. And so I just want to remind folks that I forgot to mention in the beginning, we are going to be taking questions later in the program, but please do put your questions in the chat, and we're going to try to collect them and then present them to the panelists later in the program. So please make sure you enter your questions in the chat. So you mentioned, Angelis, and we'll wrap up on this point. You mentioned that one of the ways that people can support as Amazon Prime members, there's some organizing happening there. What are some other ways that folks can support the organizing that's happening with Amazon workers?
So one, I would just always encourage folks to plug into local organizing, acknowledging most people here are in New York. But in general, always plug in with union brothers and sisters on fights to hold Amazon accountable. That's where we've really been able to coordinate so much of our power on a national scale with Athena, is local organizations working with unions to build power with elected officials on holding Amazon accountable to workers, to taxes, to community. So that's just a general principle. And we've seen that an organized community can be Amazon backed because we did it here in New York City with HQ2. An organized barrio beat a billionaire, right? And that was just one incredible coalition of housing and and worker and immigrant rights groups coming together to stand in Queens to stand up against Jeff Bezos, and we won. Now on, here. So on Amazon specifically, we are working with our national organizations and national partners on Amazon whistleblowers and supporting them directly. We have a whistleblower fund. If you know of a worker who has been fired for speaking up against Amazon, they are welcome to apply no matter where in the country, and they will get financial support for surviving this crisis. And you can plug into Make the Road, New York Communities for Change. Yeah, those are some fun actions that we had. To learn more about our organizing efforts for Amazon worker organizing specifically, we're always looking for incredible organizers to come and support. We have been able to do a lot of good work with a very small but committed team in Staten Island. Last fall, we got up to 700 signatures in a 2,000 member unit of the warehouse. And we worked with our union allies at ATU to bring Amazon to the table to address severe bus overcrowding issues. And I'll just add that, MTA, the ATU, has one of the largest public transportation systems in the country, and on multiple efforts has tried to bring Amazon to the table, and they've refused. So what does that say about how they want to work with community, invest in community, and structure that protects workers? You can, look into our website, follow us at Make the Road on Twitter. And then lastly, our Fund Excluded Workers campaign. You can go to Make the Road to learn about this as well, but we are calling on Governor Cuomo to enact a $3.5 billion fund to provide emergency income assistance to every excluded worker in the state who has paid taxes for years, but is excluded from unemployment and from federal assistance. So basically, without emergency income assistance, so many undocumented folks either have to go back to work, risk their lives, risk their family and the health of the public, or go hungry. So we are calling for that fund, and you can follow us to learn more about our efforts.
Thank you so much, Angelis, for all that information. Yes, the slides will be available. More information will be available. We will be sending out an email, and also this is being recorded, so a follow-up email will go out to all the participants. Also, I want to just let people know you can put questions in the Q&A as well. So there's a Q&A if you look down on your screen, and you can add questions there as well, the questions you might have. So next we are going to hear from Nikki from RWDSU Local 338. So Nikki, tell us a little bit more about your local and the kinds of workers that you all represent.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on this. I'm very honored to be here with such an amazing group of activists and educators. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about essential workers and honestly the members of Local 338. There's really nothing that I love more than doing that. So Local 338, we are an incredibly diverse organization and we represent workers across New York State. And we're in a very unique position where we're about 99% essential workers. So most folks know us as one of the food retail unions, but in addition to that membership, we also represent workers in pharmaceutical retail. We represent workers in medical cannabis, which was deemed essential by Governor Cuomo. And we also represent workers in healthcare at nursing homes, in human services. We represent workers who are doing Meals on Wheels right now, and who care for the developmentally disabled, and in some cases are living in group homes with the individuals that they care for. So we have a very wide range of issues that impact our members normally, but also in a lot of ways, they're very different issues now during the COVID-19 crisis, but also very similar in kind of the issues they're facing as frontline workers.
Sorry, I got muted by the host. So what are some of the issues that these workers are currently facing given this crisis? We've heard a lot about supermarket workers not having access to PPE, but also, in nursing homes and things like that, the exposure is a lot higher for workers. So what are some of the issues that you're hearing that these workers are facing right now?
Sure, and I think they can be kind of classified, and they obviously overlap, right? The stressors always overlap, but I think we can classify them in two categories, which is what's happening in their work site, but also the stressors that are impacting them outside of the workplace. So I'll start with what's happening in the workplace first. For retail at first, it was, the mass rush to supermarkets at the very outset of this crisis in March. Hoarding was a very real issue, which meant that the supermarkets were slammed. There were, and quite honestly, pharmacies were slammed too, as people, rushed to stock up on their prescriptions and other things of that nature. So it was incredibly long hours. It was incredibly taxing, both physically and emotionally, to try and constantly keep shelves full, but also dealing with customers who were themselves really stressed out, anxious, and didn't understand why there was no toilet paper on the shelves, and often taking it out on the workers who were just there trying to do their jobs. So I think at first there was the outset of that rush and that anxiety that they felt being in the work site overwhelmed by the public. And that's kind of since mellowed out a little bit. Obviously, people are shopping more because, we're home more, not necessarily ordering out as much as we were, but that initial rush has since kind of slowed a little bit. Safety is obviously always the next thing. I think people are constantly worried about, because they are out in the public, they're in the stores, they're in, the group homes or the nursing homes. There's this constant stress of, what happens if I get sick? What happens if my family gets sick? So those are something that's always on people's minds. And, I would say that, we've heard kind of horror stories in non-union settings, but for the most part, if you're working for a union employer, you have the PPEs you need to do your job. You may not, unfortunately, because this is an issue that healthcare professionals who are in hospitals are dealing with, you may not be able to get one every day or every shift, but you're getting them, and we're trying to supplement some of that. But everybody has the PPEs, but obviously at first initially as well. There was a ton of confusion. The CDC guidelines changed so frequently that it was incredibly hard to keep up with what, you know, companies should be doing, what we should be doing, what workers should be doing. And so there was a unnecessarily level of confusion, and we lost an incredible amount of time in making sure people had PPEs, because the guidance was don't wear it unless you're sick, which set us back, quite honestly, 2 to 3 weeks. And once the guidance changed to everybody should be wearing a face mask or covering, almost in the outset that went to workers had those protections. The one thing we're hearing in, you know, healthcare settings, which is not a, you know, which is something that we've also heard in our, you know, our hospitals from our sisters and brothers from NISNA and 1199, that gowns are incredibly hard to get, and that continues to be a problem. But PPEs are something that, you know, we think about, but also social distancing protocols, making sure in your retail setting that plexiglass has been installed, other barriers to keep a physical distance between yourself and the public or customers, other measures that have been in place like one-way aisles to kind of streamline the flow of traffic and minimize potential crossing of the public. But things we've heard from our members, even in terms of the social distancing protocols, are, you know, at first, because you could go to the grocery store, the public, it kind of became the place people went to hang out. People were going into the stores more often than necessarily that, you know, guidance said they should be. And now it almost feels like people are starting to let their guards down. As we see with people, you know, hanging out outside of restaurants and bars and things. But there are people who are going into stores even still not wearing masks, and that causes an incredible amount of stress and anxiety for people who are working in the stores. So this is my pitch: please wear a mask if you're going out shopping or going anywhere, quite honestly. And the other anxiety in relations to PPEs are around enforcement. So obviously you should be wearing masks, but who is going to stop you if you go into a store and you're not wearing one? So we fought very hard to make sure that our workers don't have that interaction, that's something that management or security needs to push through, because quite honestly, we don't need an incident where somebody is getting hurt because they're telling a customer who might be upset or frustrated, having a bad day, and they take it out on that worker. So those are some of the internal things, but I think some of the external stressors which do bleed over are, you know, we have our sisters and brothers from TWU and ATU. I think the stress of taking public transportation, you know, they're doing a great job cleaning the trains, and buses, but that doesn't alleviate necessarily someone who's already at a heightened stress level. Childcare was a big issue that we kept getting calls about once the announcement about the schools being closed came through, because people were worried about, where am I going to put my child that's a safe, healthy environment. So we were very grateful for New York City and the governor's office and the mayor's office and the surrounding counties for working with us to make sure that no matter what kind of essential worker you were, you had access to a place that was safe. You could bring your child to reliably and know that they were going to be cared for. So that was one of the big ones we heard about. And I think personally, a thing based on some of the things that I'm hearing, I think about long-term implications that worries me and stresses me out is because there are so many unknowns with this disease and this virus, is what are the long-term health implications going to be on essential workers, whether you're in retail, whether you're in transportation, whether you're in healthcare? How is that going to impact you, your health long-term if you do contract COVID? But quite honestly, also the emotional and mental stress that's putting on you, how does that impact your mental health long-term?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so there have been some wins, you know, in grocery retail and other industries around hazard pay during these times. There's been multiple extensions of hazard pay, but what are some other positives or other wins that have happened for workers in these conditions? And the next follow-up question after that is, what about non-union workers? Like, have you all heard from them? What have they been experiencing? Since, you know, unionized workers have an added level of protection because, you know, they have a union and the voice and they're able to kind of negotiate these changes. but non-union workers are in a more vulnerable position.
So I think some of the things besides the hazard pay, and we've, a lot of them have done the right thing, right? But we've been the ones kind of pushing them along to extend it, as you said, which has been very helpful. I think some of the other benefits that where we've played a role, as you said, is the extra layer of protection, is in situations where, particularly at the outset, where a smaller employer wasn't able to get PPEs because it was almost nearly impossible to get masks. We stepped in and kind of helped figure out vendors for them. We partnered with our sisters and brothers at UFCW 1500 and 342 to bulk purchase masks so that we could provide a stopgap for places where they didn't have enough or couldn't get any. But I think some of the other wins, besides some of the social distancing protocols, we worked together to figure out best practices. Whether it was, for instance, in our medical cannabis industry, we figured out a system of staggering shifts. It's a little bit easier to do in a situation like that, where you can figure out more flexible schedules. Can't necessarily do that with grocery stores, but we did partner with grocery stores about, early hours for seniors and those who were immunocompromised or at higher risk, to make sure, help not just our members, but the general public. I think the other things that we worked with employers on is, a couple of things, right? One was things changed so quickly. So we made sure that they knew what the best practices were, what information they needed to have to implement. There was a lot of gray area when it came to even the emergency paid sick leave that was passed at the federal and state level. So we held them accountable and made sure they knew what to do. I would say employers should always make sure they understand the laws and be a little bit, whether they have an attorney or an HR person, but there's so much gray area, and that they're doing the right thing, quite honestly. So we pushed a lot of them along. But the other thing I think employers need to be mindful of, and that was something we did see for many of the companies we represent, was just to be a little bit more flexible than they normally would. Morale is not the best right now. People are terrified, they're anxious, they're stressed. And we worked with the companies at the outset, and many of them were coming to us saying, we know childcare is an issue. We're going to lessen our time and attendance policies to just make sure people are coming into work, right? We need the people right now, but we're not going to penalize people because we know that there's a lot of different things happening behind the scenes that we may not be aware of, whether it's they're dealing with childcare issues, they're dealing with an elderly relative and making sure that they have what they need to stay inside and be healthy and safe. So I think that's something that should be that may not be necessarily thought about, but being a little bit more sympathetic and flexible for people who are on the front lines, who are dealing with all sorts of issues at home and at work, and that's something that's incredibly helpful. To your question about the non-union setting, we actually did get a couple of calls at the outset of the pandemic, and believe it or not, actually came from a store manager, which was very interesting. And they were, some of the questions that we actually got were, am I, like, my company, are we an essential business? Why are we open? I don't understand. So that was a really very interesting question to get. But a lot of the things that we're seeing are related to PPEs, and health and safety protocols. Like, those are the calls we've gotten. And I think partially because of the press that's happening around, whether it's nationally at Kroger, calling on companies like Kroger who are multi-state operations to do better, to do hazard pay, and quite honestly extend it. They got pressured pretty intensely in the last week after they announced that they were not going to extend their hazard pay. And granted, there are no Krogers here, but I think that national attention on what companies should be doing and being held accountable also makes those who are working in non-union settings, whether you're working in a grocery store or a healthcare setting or even a pharmacy, of, well, why do they have it and I don't, and I'm doing the same kind of work and I need to make sure that that's changed. This is unfair. And so I think they're calling unions, and workers are calling unions in a way that they might not have 4 months ago, quite honestly.
Thank you, Nikki. Also to the panelists, if you want to look at some of the questions in the Q&A and you want to answer some of those in the Q&A, Q&A. So Nikki, a last question that came. So, you know, the retail industry is being heavily impacted. There's a lot of bankruptcy. You know, big, large retail stores like Lord and Taylor and all these other different stores. And is there any thoughts moving forward? What's going to be the recovery for those kinds of industries, and you know how your members are being impacted by that as well, since these stores are closed to the public now and it's only online?
Sure, I think, and we're, you know, Local 338 doesn't necessarily represent traditional retail, but there are conversations happening at our national level at the RWDSU, which some of our sister unions like 1102 who do represent clothing retail, who have unfortunately, you know, those workers are unemployed right now. And I think this is a conversation of, we've already started seeing a shift towards online retail, and unfortunately the pandemic has kind of sped up that transition. So the conversations are, and I think in the interim, you know, we've figured out a lot of the essential companies or businesses are hiring. So we've done our best to make sure, you know, whether it's 1102 workers at our, you know, Zara's or Macy's or Bloomingdale's, know that these companies are hiring and their union providing similar benefits, so that those are opportunities for those workers who are currently, unfortunately, unemployed. But I think the conversation is figuring out, you know, and I think this is not something that's unique to retail, right? There are a lot of industries that are being greatly impacted by unemployment. Like, what's the future of the restaurant industry, right? There are a lot of industries where they're going to be changed in a way that I personally can't even wrap my head around most days. So I think it's going to be a lot of conversations around how do we support them short term, make sure that they have, you know, their families they're able to make rent, their families are made whole at the moment, but ensuring that they have protections long term if those companies do close permanently. What does severance look like? How do we support them as they transition out from those companies that are closing? But also, in a larger societal conversation, is how do we help workers who are going to be unemployed long term find new skills, find new programs to put them into different jobs? Whether it's, you know, there's all conversations about a new public works program, but training people for a new future, which we may not even necessarily know what that looks like in 6 months from now, but recognizing that we have to start having those conversations. And that is happening at the RWDSU. But I think right now everyone's very focused on how we help people in the short term get through this crisis, with their health, and, you know, with as minimal pain as possible.
Thank you so much, Nikki. Again, here you see a slide that has more information about Local 338. And also you can add questions in the Q&A, and we're going to try to answer as many questions as we can. So next we're going to move to our next panelist, Mark Henry from the ATU. Mark, do you want to tell us a little bit about your members, how they've been impacted by COVID-19, and what the response has been from ATU, and what you're doing around organizing around these issues?
Sure. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Mark Henry. I'm the president and business agent for Local 1056. I represent the bus operators and maintenance personnel in Queens for New York City Transit. And to say the least, that COVID disrupted our lives is an understatement. I think many of our members were infected, their families were infected, and we've had many lives that were lost. Many of us learned through the media on how this infectious disease really impacted the communities out here and our workforce. And being thrusted into the front lines the way we were took its impact on our membership in general. I think that basically we went through a wide range of emotions, to say the least, from anger to fear, from being lost to being misinformed, to being neglected, to feeling like pawns. We saw things that probably we should have been more prepared for and weren't properly prepared for. Even though there are guides and manuals out there, I think, you know, we had a breakdown with the communication with our management structure in New York City Transit, and the unions did galvanize to try to protect our members as best we could. It's an ongoing fight, to say the least. It's an ongoing fight. I heard what was spoke today with the Amazon population, and you know, their reality is what we have gone through in New York City Transit over the years, and it's a struggle with the managements, the way they have tried to dictate how the workforce should operate, how the workforce should be together, and it's a constant fight. To see this state go on pause the way it did, to see our members thrusted to the front lines the way we were, to see us not get the answers that we were deserving of, is shocking. It's embarrassing to me as a labor leader, and I know nobody in my workforce or my membership signed up for anything like we've encountered. Not at all. I think we were basically blindsided. We were given a false narrative by management and by the CDC in regards to what protects us and what doesn't protect us. We were villainized out by local management and not being able to wear the proper PPE. And it caused us to kind of galvanize and make sure that, you know, proper safety measures are taking place. I know my sister local out in Staten Island had to do things in regards to Amazon with the increase in population going to that facility out there. We had to get more bus service in certain areas to make sure that there's proper spacing and distancing. And in Queens, we had to do the same thing. We had to recognize that, hey, you can't carry all these essential workers. We know who's essential. Everybody can't be essential, you know, but we understood that we had a job to do out here. And we just didn't like being played with. We didn't like being guinea pigs. So
Mark, I know that the ATU has a petition that they're circulating. Do you, about ensuring safety protections for workers, what are they demanding as safety measures from employers in that petition?
Well, in that petition, basic PPE items are being demanded on a regular basis, a daily basis, like face masks or face covering, face shields. In certain locations, we need that. Gloves, sanitizer, the way that we campaign to have the rear door boarding on buses, providing social distancing from our operators to protect them, getting barriers placed inside the bus to protect our operators from, you know, this virus, even down to the way the equipment is set up. We had to work on that, and we demand that they make and address these changes that we keep bringing forward. The equipment that the Transit Authority has purchased has to be reimagined and redesigned and quickly, and we're pressing them on those issues. You know, we're also asking for like a no mask, no ride provision that should be throughout all of transit, whether it's in this city or across the nation. Pandemic leave to reassure our families and address our family needs. Hazard pay, another thing that we should be getting during this crisis. We understand, and we're sacrificing our lives for this city of New York, the people of New York, and we're deserving of some type of recognition. And at the end of the day, you know, we don't ever want to see this happen again by our management team, and we want our jobs, but not at the cost of losing our lives.
Thank you, Mark. And so, Mark, what has the response been? Has there been a difference in response from public agencies and private agencies? And what do you see in the future? You know, there's expected to be major budget cuts. So what are your thoughts around that, and kind of what has the response been? And And how is the union responding to these possibilities or thinking about this in the future?
Not quite sure what the public and private employers and how they really realize the damage has been done throughout this whole pandemic in our relationship as worker to the company that we work for. Management's mishaps have heightened and basically have made a real line that was thinner, and it has tested us at levels we've never seen since early in the labor movement. You know, my education of the labor movement. It's like crises like this that make the union stronger. We need more unions. They're invaluable currently. Campaigns, you know, we're going to focus on many campaigns in regards to the riding public and our employee safety. We're going to organize the unorganized going forward. It's overdue, and it must be done, and we're going to do it.
Thank you, Mark. And one last question is, how can we support the members of the ATU? What can we do to support?
Well, there's many ways you can support this. The members of this audience and the residents from the city, you got to start speaking to your legislators. You know, government moves slowly until their constituents basically remind them that we're here and there are needs that need to be met. This virus, this COVID, has exposed many communities throughout the city and of their shortfalls on their amenities that they should be getting as taxpayers, the essential services that they should be getting, whether it's transit services or hospital services, grocery stores, even down to the restaurants that we have in our communities. It has exposed so much in a short period of time, but individuals really need to start talking and speak to transit workers and let us show, you know, we'll tell you our story. And you'll find it to be an amazing story of perseverance over things that you probably would never wish on any family member or any friend that you ever had. The politics can't be a dividing line. And we see that in the, you know, major and federal level. That can't be it. When it comes down to transit and just using that as my industry, if you want a community to thrive, you need public transit in that community. Transit is the people's way of getting around. It's the way people get to school, work, and etc. You have to have an obligation to it. You have to have an obligation that this is not somebody else's problem. It's my problem as well, and I have to be engaged in this process.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Mark. So that really brings this all together, right? Because we're talking about essential workers who have to use public transportation, essential workers who are often Black, brown people and women and are impacted by this, and how this is all compounded. It kind of sheds light on these intersections, but also these compounded institutional problems. So thank you, Mark. Next, we're going to hear from Eric Logo from TW Local 100. Eric, do you want to say a little bit about TW Local 100 and what members have been facing, and also kind of how TW has been responding?
Hi, so thanks for having me. TW Local 100 represents 45,000 transit workers, primarily in the MTA. My department is rapid transit, so I represent the subway conductors, train operators, and tower operators. We have more than 7,000 of those members in my department. TW, like ATU and many other essential workers, have been on the front lines throughout this pandemic. We have been moving subway service and bus service throughout, and our members have suffered tremendous losses. It's really been incalculable, the toll that this plague has taken on frontline workers, but particularly the transit workers of this city. I think the story, and the book obviously is not written on this yet, but I think the story, or one of the stories from all of this, is the slow response, right? Whether it's from governments or organizations, the delayed response to this crisis, to the pandemic. Now, you could say, in fairness, nobody's ever dealt with something like this before, right? But our employer, the MTA, did actually have a pandemic plan on the books for many years, which apparently they didn't follow. All right, so as recently as early March, the TW was fighting with the MTA about masks, right? So they took this position that okay, I was muted there momentarily. Okay, so the TW was fighting with the MTA from the very beginning. For example, masks. In the very beginning, they were saying it's not part of your uniform. This is a ridiculous position to take, but this is what we had to contend with. So we got the MTA to move off of that position. I mean, we were going to tell our members, and we were telling them anyway, if wearing a mask makes you more comfortable, just do it. It's a matter of your personal safety and comfort. You have a right to do it. So they moved off the no mask position, but then the position was they weren't going to provide them. Now, you can also say, in fairness, masks still are a commodity, which is absurd in this society, right? I mean, with the productive resources that we have, in terms of factories and capitalism, like, there should be enough masks. There should be enough masks. There should be enough gloves, gowns, ventilators, all of these things. There shouldn't be any scarcity in this area. But they took a position that they weren't going to provide them. So that changed. We put pressure on them, and eventually they started providing surgical masks, and then later the N95 respirators. In terms of other PPE, gloves, hand sanitizers, these are things that we were able to push the employer to provide. So, we really shouldn't have to, like, that. Those things shouldn't be that kind of an issue, right? I mean, it's in everyone's best interest. It's in the union's best interest for our members, and it's in the employer's best interest for their employees to provide these things, to protect them. But unfortunately, there were battles that were had about this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Eric, is there any discussion about coordination between other unions that represent MTA workers? Has there been any coordination in pressuring the MTA and things like that between unions that represent MTA workers?
I know that our president maintains contact with the other transportation unions in the metropolitan area, whether it's ATU or the Long Island Railroad unions. In my role, I'm primarily focused on the rapid transit department. So the goings on in the subway, advocating for the train crews and the things that they need during this crisis. We've gotten certain things, but there are still things that we're trying to get from them. The union did put together a 10-point plan, excuse me, calling upon federal and local governments, as well as the employers, to provide certain things. Hazard pay is at the top of the list. Personal protective equipment. I think at this point we're pretty good in terms of availability of PPE, but we don't want the employer to slip. We don't want that to, become an issue again. We don't want to repeat these things, right? Testing and tracing. Now, this is an area where the employer, I think in the beginning, especially, there was a real problem in terms of their internal tracing capacity, right? They established this hotline that employees were supposed to call, if they had symptoms or they felt that they were exposed to someone. But there were serious problems with members being able to get through and get the answers that they needed at that time. So we found ourselves as union representatives relaying this information on behalf of the member to the employer. We kind of stepped outside of our box in a number of different ways, communicating things to the employer, because there was a communication breakdown, as Mark mentioned, with his employers. We had, similar problems here in TWU with maintaining communication, which was vital at that time. So testing and tracing, temperature checks. This is something that has been introduced at a number of locations where employees self-administer a temperature check as sort of like a first sign that they might possibly be ill, to try to reduce the spread of the virus in the workforce. Protective barriers and shields. So we got this to an extent on the buses, where the buses have a rear door boarding policy. Before more and more people come back to this subway system, we're going to need, because there's very few people riding the trains right now, but before more people return to the subway, and the MTA chairman is saying it could be like up to 60% by the fall. So just in terms of numbers, that's millions of people, right? Right now, the ridership is down into like the 400,000 range, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 people a day, whereas we normally transport up to 6 million people a day. So it's a major drop off. It's more than 90%. But before there's any kind of normalization, we want to see some kind of protective barrier or area around the operators' cabs for the conductors and the train operators. The homelessness crisis has also been something that impacts transit workers and riders. I'm certainly sympathetic, and I think that it's a problem that's bigger than us, right? It's a failure of this society to adequately care for its people, to provide.
Eric, you're muted.
Oh.
Yeah, there we go. You're good now.
Okay. Sorry. So, this is something that the city needs to get a handle on. The city needs to provide housing. Shelters are not long-term housing. That's a temporary, transition. They also need to provide mental health services and medical treatment. This is a very vulnerable population, and the large numbers of homeless in the subway system pose a risk to our members, because they're not getting the kind of care and treatment and attention that they need.
Yeah, so I know there has been some discussions and something has come up about the non-union cleaners at the MTA stations. But in addition to that, do you think this presents an opportunity for greater union militancy in confronting all these challenges, and an opportunity to build power for TWU members and just for workers of the MTA? Is there an opportunity here, do you see, for building power and with these non-union cleaners? No, Eric, you're there.
There we go. So I would, one of the things I would look forward to, that I would want to see emerge from all of this, is a greater degree of social awareness and social and class consciousness for what, not just transit workers have had to endure, but all working people have had to endure, during this crisis. I think an important theme, something that people feel instinctually, but is best summed up in the phrase that we are essential but not expendable. Yes, we have a job to do, an important job to do, but the lives of working people are not something to be toyed with. It's unfortunately, the powers that be, the ones who control society politically and economically, are always looking out for themselves and ensuring that they have what they need. But it's us, the working class, that have to fight and scrap to get basic necessities. And that's a consequence of the type of society that we live in, and who controls the society, and where their interests are aligned. The fact that, as one of our other panelists talked about Amazon, it's obscene, right? That there's a trillionaire, or about to be a trillionaire, in this country, when you have so many people doing without, so many people struggling. So I would hope that, what we've suffered here leads to some kind of greater consciousness of the factors that are at play.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists. We're going to move into Q&A in a little bit. But one last question that I want to present to the entire panel is, how do we see this pandemic, this crisis, as an opportunity to build power and sustain change for these essential workers who, as we said, as we started this conversation, are often not visible, are often undervalued, and usually primarily are low income, are women, people of color, immigrants. So how do you see this being a moment where we can build power and sustain these changes, whether it's through hazard pay, protective measures, and bargaining, but even beyond that? How do you see this moment helping to build worker power in New York City and beyond? Nikki?
I'll start. I think there's, two parts of this. I think internal organizing is going to be critical. And I think one of the things that I've heard from talking to my members and from hearing conversations with union reps and members is, a lot of the work that essential workers do, as you said, and I think everyone said here, has been invisible and undervalued. And I think workers doing those jobs internalize that. And I think now, because it's, sexy to be an essential worker, I think it's finally giving people a renewed sense of pride in the work that they're doing. And I think, our members, have said to me, you can't put me in a classification of frontline worker or, somebody in the hospital, but, I know what I'm doing is important. I'm sustaining community. So I think having people who have this renewed sense of empowerment, and unfortunately it took a tragedy to make that happen, but I think that's important to a lot of the work that we're all doing to mobilize our existing membership. But I think, looking externally, besides, workers having this new validation that they should be getting more, that they have earned more, I think the one thing that's been helpful is the media attention on essential workers. I mean, when was the last time you really heard anyone talking about what's happening in meatpacking plants, right? So I think the public has a renewed interest in where their food's coming from, who's delivering their packages, who's stocking their shelves, who's, driving the buses every day. So I think having a public that's a little bit more engaged than they were this time last year People are cheering at 7 p.m. and that's amazing. And I think if we can harness that excitement that happens every single night into a real way, so that when they see a picket line or whatever the new normal looks like, and there's a worker action happening, they might be more inclined to stop and ask. They might be more inclined to sign the petition in support of the Amazon workers, or find out how they can get involved in a way that they were too busy to do, or maybe just didn't necessarily stop and think about that workforce before they saw a news briefing about the atrocious things that are happening in Amazon warehouses or meat packing plants, or multi-billion-dollar companies who are clawing back hazard pay. So I think that's definitely something that if you can find a silver lining in all of this, I think that's a silver lining.
Yeah, thank you, Nikki. So Josh, do you want to say a quick word, and then we'll move to the other panelists? You're muted, Josh.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I would say that this is the time to be bold, if there ever was one. And let's not underestimate what's possible. Let me just give 2 examples of the kinds of things we could do. There is no reason why the state of New York could not pass a law that says no employer, let's say with more than 50 people, can reopen without a health and safety panel that includes 50% worker membership, that has the right to shut down operations if they see dangerous conditions. This is not a fantasy. This can be done, right? It could probably even be done by an executive order, right? New York City could do this, right? We shouldn't have to beg, for these things, right? Let's get that power into the hands of workers. Or on the financial side, the United States twice had U.S. national banks. The state of North Dakota has a state bank. Let's not pour money back into these financial institutions that have failed us. Let's set up a New York State bank. There's no reason why we can't do that. Let's put our resources to our use, and let's demand that half the board of that bank be working people. And let's come up with 10 other ideas like this. This is the time. This is the time, and we should not sell ourselves short.
Thank you, Josh. And Angelis, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I really love what our panelist Josh said about being bold. This is the moment to really have some imagination, right? I think that for so long, capitalism has entrenched that what we have is what we've been given, and we can only ask for a little bit more, while the mega rich are literally getting massive tax bailouts while our poor neighbors are dying, right? And for the larger question of long-term power, of course, there is always worker organizing that needs to be supported, retained, leadership to be developed, plugged into larger local, national, and international organizing spaces. But I do think in order for the labor movement to really overcome this pandemic and come out stronger, we don't need to go back to normal. Normal was, we were already seeing exacerbated wage theft and discrimination and labor abuse, and the mega rich getting away with refusing to negotiate with unions and with workers. And we need to create a better standard than what we already have post-COVID. And I do think that requires our labor leaders on a national scale and on a local scale to coordinate with community organizations, actively organizing youth, immigrant, elders, folks in our communities, and that we approach these massive corporations with a multi-issue lens of how we take on monopolies and how we take on corporations that have their tentacles in every areas of our lives. We need to organize across aspects of education, immigration rights, worker rights, housing rights, because these corporations are dictating standards in so many areas of our lives. We cannot just organize in the workplace, we have to organize in the community. And I think that when we bring our assets together, we're gonna come out stronger on the other end with demands that are intersectional, that are demanding protections for essential workers, union or non-union. Our political power will be stronger, and our organized community will be larger.
Thank you, Angelis. That was really strong. And it's kind of some that's been reiterated in the Q&A, building power beyond silos, right? Building power, building community labor power, building these partnerships, really building a workers' movement. Mark, would you like to go next? Oh, you're muted, Mark.
Got it.
Oh, there you go.
All right, thank you. I think a lot of the panelists have already kind of stated what I had envisioned in my mind. Yes, this is a time to be bold. I know dealing with our international union, we deal with a lot of multinational corporations, and the problems that have come out of that and the issues that we're battling against require a whole lot of internal organizing of our membership and our communities that are around those memberships that we serve. I envision us really partnering, reigniting those partnerships with communities or organizations that we've never partnered with before. I envision that being reborn again, because I think that's how the labor movement kind of got its legs initially. I think that is one of the driving forces that has to be sustained during this moment, but it has to be built long-term into an overarching movement. And I think, our membership, though they sometimes can be a little short-sighted, have to look at the long-range goal of this. And the long-range goal is we all in this together. We all have to be engaged to succeed. We all have to have those difficult conversations and be an arm in arm in order for this to really progress into something great. So I'm looking for better partnerships out of this whole endeavor.
Thank you, Mark. And I just want to announce that we are going to go a little bit longer than 10:30. So just wanted to announce that to everyone. So if you're able to stay on, please do. And we will try to address some of the questions, although some have been answered already in the Q&A, but we will try to answer some questions. Eric, would you like to go next? Eric, you're muted. You're muted.
I'm good, okay? All right. So I like the fact that Mark mentioned internal organizing. As important as it is to reach out to other groups of workers, and that is ultimately what we have to do, right? Is to develop real solidarity with other workers and recognize that, even though we work in different sectors, that we belong to different unions, our interests, in the big picture in society are aligned, right? We work for a living, we sell our labor for a living, we put ourselves at risk, okay? We don't simply profit from other people's labor or, make interest or receive dividends. But internally, I feel that there's work, at least in my union, that as leaders we can do to try to develop more solidarity inside our organization, and empower our workers, our members, in terms of their rights, and their history. And that's something that I look forward to being able to do more of. The pandemic has kind of put us in a mode where we're putting out fires, to a large extent, where, you're always dealing with crises as a union leader, but especially now, we're dealing with a lot of crises. But internal organizing is very important to me. Raising people's level of consciousness and as others have said, not letting this moment or let our sacrifice get away from us and go back to business as usual and put, capital interests in charge of some kind of rebuilding or, next version of society. I mean, our people put their lives on the line. Our people lost their lives. Okay. We showed what it meant to be essential. We absolutely deserve to have, we should be running the table, but we absolutely deserve to have at least a seat at that table in the near future.
Thank you, Eric. So to kind of bring it all together and wrap up, and I'm gonna kind of merge some questions together that came out of the audience. Something, how can, and we started to answer this question, how can society as a whole come in solidarity with labor unions and workers? How can that happen? But also, what is one takeaway for the participants of what needs to change for the future? What's one takeaway that you want to leave participants with about what needs to change for the future? So, Angelis, would you, Andres, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? I just want to say, I think one of the things that we really need to work on is doing more of this, bringing different organizations and different unions together, having these discussions in the same space. And more of these panels, meetings, conversations, discussions is only going to make our collective push stronger. And so, I don't know, for the last hour and a half, I think what we've done here has been an incredible step in making each of our organizations, each of our work better than it was before this panel discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, so what's one takeaway? What needs to change for the future, for us to build this worker power, for us to build this worker movement? Like, what do we want to leave participants with after this conversation? Angelis, I'm gonna choose you.
Yeah, of course. I really think that coordinated efforts, like what Andres is saying, bringing community organizations, labor together, advocacy organizations with a greater focus on, honestly, it's so much of the issue comes down to like campaign finance. It's campaign finance and monopoly corporations that are dictating where state budgets, how state budgets are decided, right? There's this massive inequality in New York State. We have 112 billionaires, and yet we have the highest death rate of a largely immigrant Black and Brown community. And I think that with one takeaway here is how can we put all of our political organizing and community strength and capital together to take on the corporate elites in our state that are forcing us to have to just think about how do we protect our own membership because the state budget is slashed, or I've got my own people to watch out for, which is real. But they're organizing, the elite are also organizing to protect each other as well. And our state legislature, unfortunately, many, our governor and many leaders in our state legislature are turning, are not doing enough to tax the rich and to create revenue that we need when we're negotiating collective bargaining agreements for especially public sector unions, and when we're organizing for greater protections for private sector workers and non-union workers. So I really do think that we all got to come together on how we're gonna take back the wealth in New York State and use that to build the sort of agenda that we need and build a workers' party.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Angelis. Also, to just make a quick announcement, we tried to get to all the questions. Some of them were answered in the Q&A, but we are compiling them and hope to continue this conversation offline. So we will try our best to get to your questions. And if you have specific questions, we'll definitely get to that. For specific individuals, we'll share that with those individuals as well. And so their last question for all. Okay, thank you. Sorry, just reading something in the chat. All right, so does anyone else want to answer the question about what we take away from this, what needs to change moving forward?
I think I just kind of want to reiterate what Andres said, which is I think all too often, and I think part of, right now we are all putting out fires. But I think there is an opportunity for us to kind of break out of the silos a little bit and talk a little bit more, because it often sometimes feels like we all think we know best for what workers in different industries, what works for them. And that's not necessarily the case. I think we need to have larger coalitions talking about different things, and that way we can really create and craft informed policies that are going to uplift workers. But that really only starts, I think, by listening and getting feedback from the people who are doing the work about what's going to benefit them, but also what's going to be, quite honestly, sustainable for them long-term too, because short-term fixes don't necessarily have long-term results, and we're only going to get there by not necessarily talking to each other, but also making sure we're really absorbing and listening to the information that we're being given.
Thank you, Nikki. Mark?
Oh, yes. I was briefly, I was going to say, if you're a leader or a member or a citizen, I always believe that you're envisioning for something better, or your expectation should be for something better. I was in a small town in Canada, and the workers were fighting for just basic rights. And my international union happened to be in town for a conference, and we joined that fight. And I think that's what needs to be kind of restarted again. Like, your fight is my fight, that type of thing, to get folks engaged, and just understand that on every corner there's an ally, and hopefully out of this there'll be allies and more allies. And like, that's one of our phrases we use, an allies in every bus stop for our case. But I know there are allies all over this social media. There's allies in the media, and there are allies in public office that we gotta hold accountable, and hopefully we'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Josh, did you have a comment?
Just very quickly, I think two things that have really struck me over the last few months is one, how innovative ordinary people have been in dealing with problems that authorities are not solving. Turning their living rooms into making masks, raising supplies for out-of-town healthcare workers, down the line. This incredible inventiveness, and combined with a sense of social solidarity, not just clapping at 7 p.m., but building neighborhood watch networks to take care of their older neighbors, to try to help each other out. And I think these spirits of kind of just taking care of ourselves because no one else is going to do it, I think is something that we need to carry forward, and we have to really remember how much we can do, and keep that in mind, that we can't go back to the old system.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all the staff and faculty at SLU for helping put this together. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate your time and everything that you're doing. You can learn more about our school. You can go to slu.cuny.edu. You can learn more about our different programs as well. As I mentioned earlier in the call, there will be a recording that will be shared along with other information from the panel that will be shared via email to all the participants. So there'll be a link to the video. I just want to end by thanking all of you for taking the opportunity to also participate in this conversation. We all are going through this crisis together in different ways. And as workers, as community, as people, we have a lot of opportunities to build power together and envision a future that we want to see. So, like the saying goes, I do believe another world is possible, and I think that we can do it. Thank you again, and have a great day. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Okay.
Thank you.